If we could all give Mauricio a huge round of applause, we'll pass it over.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it. Nice and clean. How's everyone doing? Thanks so much for coming out. Really appreciate it. Wow, what a turnout. Really want to thank Matt and Dorina for inviting me, but also for putting this amazing event together. I was almost shocked to see this many people. You hear of a meetup, and I speak at quite a few meetups, and they're not anywhere near as big as this. So congratulations, guys, for building this. I really appreciate you guys coming out. My mentor, Jim Rohn, used to say, time is more valuable than money. You can always get more money, but you can never get more time. So I really appreciate you guys coming here, and really appreciate you guys sticking around to listen to the attorney. Like, who comes to an event to listen to a freaking lawyer? So I appreciate you guys sticking around for that. I am a lawyer, but I'm not your typical lawyer. I think you've probably heard me now say a little bit that most people say I'm one of the few lawyers that actually speaks English. So that's kind of my thing that I like to do. It's my spiel. Just kind of take these boring or complex securities matters, syndication stuff, which we'll talk about in a second, and distill them into kind of easy to understand things. So really, really appreciate you guys being out here. What I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about the syndication process, but really you've got to, just like Matt said, it's a puzzle, right? When you're doing a syndication, there's so many different pieces, and the legal piece is just one of those pieces, and that's where I fit in. And my job in general is to just make you understand and aware where that syndication piece fits into the overall puzzle. Because you're like the quarterback, or the sort of, you're the person behind it, right? You don't have to know all the little nuances and technical stuff, but you want to have a basic understanding or a contextual thing. So that's what I want to talk about here before. Just Matt said a little bit. How does this work? Do I need to open? Oh, there we go. So I think, do I need to connect it there? Or, anyway, so I'm the founder and CEO of Premier Law Group. I set this up about 15 years ago now. I've been actually practicing securities work for almost 20 years. 100% of my practice is syndication. So that's all I do day in and day out, is helping clients like Matt and other syndicators make sure that they are compliant with federal and state securities laws. Hopefully that doesn't get too complicated. Been doing this for 20 plus years. I'm legal. Anybody, Matt mentioned the real estate guys. Anybody heard of the real estate guys before? So they're great. Okay, good. Wow, that's a good turnout. So I'm their legal advisor. Actually used to work for them back in the day. And maybe I'll tell a little bit about my story. Just to give you a little bit of context, but I grew up, I'm originally from Santiago, Chile, actually, so I grew up nowhere near here, and came to the States, 30 some odd years ago, and went to school, up at Cal Berkeley. And then I did what every lawyer dreams of doing, which is I went to work for, a big law firm, great law firm, by the way. Most law firms are sweatshops, they're horrible. This was an amazing law firm, but it just wasn't what I wanted to do, right? And I was very lucky early on to meet the real estate guys, Robert and Russ, thanks to actually not knowing him at the time, but Robert Kiyosaki. I read his book, Rich Dad Poor Dad. Anybody read Robert's book, right? Amazing, life-changing book. I read that, changed my whole life, really, and it was interesting. I was actually driving, literally about a week after I read that book, and I was driving along the streets of LA, and I heard a radio drop-in from Robert Kiyosaki. Had I not read the book, wouldn't have meant anything, but Robert comes on the radio and says, hey, if you're serious about, my name is Robert Kiyosaki, whatever, author of Rich Dad Poor Dad. If you're serious about investing in real estate, check out the real estate guys. They really know what they're talking about. And so that really caught me, and I went to one of their events, and long story short, left my job very shortly after and went to work with them in-house. And that's really where I cut my teeth in the syndication world, because I did all of their PPMs, all their syndication work, which they were doing a lot back then. And we did a lot of stuff like this. This was before the internet, right? Before you did like Zoom meetings. We actually did physical meetings like this, and we pitched deals like this. Can you imagine that, doing that, Matt? Like physically, people would come, 60 people in a room, you'd make a presentation, a pitch, and then you'd have physical documents, Matt. Physical documents that we would pass out to investors, and they would hand us checks. For those of you who don't know, checks are little pieces of paper that you write on there, and actually you hand them over there, and it's the same as cash. But anyway, so we did that for a long time, and then the real estate guys had a huge following, and I just started to do a little bit of work with them on the side, a lot of asset protection back then, and that just kind of sprung into my own little business, and I created Premier Law Group now 2006, I think, is when I created it, and kept the real estate guys obviously as a VIP client, but that's kind of how I took over. So that's kind of my spiel. What I wanted to talk about today, I can see over there. First of all, I'm half blind too, so they're good. So what I wanted to talk about is I just finished writing an ebook, which I've been writing for like 4 months or 5 months or 6 months or a year. I don't even remember how long it's been, but I called it The 5 Things Every Syndicator Must Know to Stay Out of Jail. And it was just kind of a funky thing that it came into my mind. The reason I came up with this ebook is just I think any topic about syndication that I can talk to, I can always tie it back to something in this in this ebook, right? So no matter what I'm talking about. But I wanted to write this thing, and so I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about a couple of those important things. I think we'll get through 3 of them, I think. But if we have more time, we'll get through more, and if not, we'll just do 2. And the title of this book is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. You know, the odds of you going to jail, just so you want to just not freak you out too much right from the beginning. People get freaked out when I talk, but don't get too freaked out. You're most likely not going to jail. Most likely. Unless you're really defrauding investors. So those of you, who of you here are intending on defrauding your investors when you're raising money? Anyone other than Matt? Anybody else? Sorry. So you're probably not going to jail unless you're Bernie Madoff, right? If you're actually defrauding, intentionally defrauding, or doing a pyramid scheme or a Ponzi scheme, not a pyramid scheme, a Ponzi scheme, then that's when these issues. But most of the time, you're not going to jail, but the consequences are still pretty steep, right? Most likely, the most common penalty for illegally raising money is what we call rescission, which essentially means you've got to give the money back to the investors plus interest, whether it was your fault or not. So imagine back in 2008, the financial crisis, where a lot of people lost a lot of money because financial markets froze up and just things went bad, but it didn't go bad by any fault of the syndicator. Just things happened, unexpected things happen. But if you didn't do it right, you could still be on the hook to return your investors' money plus interest. So that's one of the main reasons we want to make sure, because how many of you really want to guarantee your investors' returns? You actually want to guarantee when somebody invests with you, their money returns. No, I don't think you do. I don't think you do.
But I want to make it happen.
You want to make it happen, but you don't want to be in the business of guaranteeing. Sometimes things just don't work out, markets change, things that are out of your control. So we don't want to do that. The other thing that will happen is you'll basically be barred from raising money either ever again or for a long period of time. So if this is something you really want to do, just having that on your resume is going to probably end your career as a syndicator, which obviously we don't want to do. And in my experience, what typically happens is most syndicators just, if they do it wrong, they end up filing for bankruptcy because if they raise $3-4 million and now they got to return everybody's money, they don't have $3-4 million, so they end up filing for bankruptcy. So the point of that is the consequences are steep, even though you're not probably going to jail. But it's still things that you want to think about. So the first one, it's getting hot, like I was freezing when I got in here. Now I'm like sweating bullets. The first mistake, so let's go through some of the biggest things you want to realize, things that you want to, the things you want to just keep in mind to stay out of jail. The first one is understand that you are actually selling securities. Okay, that's one of the big, a lot of, especially first-time syndicators, run into the trap of thinking that whatever it is that they're doing doesn't involve the sale of securities. First of all, they're buying real estate, so they're thinking, well, why is the SEC even involved? Like, why is the securities laws? I'm just buying a piece of property, right? Like, why are the securities involved? Or my favorite is actually more seasoned investors or syndicators who try and get creative, and then they try and structure their deal in such a way that they're like, well, this is like some weird thing I'm coming up. We're getting around it. We're not really selling securities, and therefore we didn't have securities laws. But nothing could be further from the truth. When you guys think of a security, what do you guys think about? Stocks and bonds and mutual funds, all that, the stock market kind of thing. The SEC disagrees with you a little bit, and they take a very broad approach of what a security is. And for them, a security essentially, well, there's like a technical version, but I'll give you the English version. Anytime that you take money from investors where the returns are generated by your efforts, anytime you take money from investors where the returns are generated by your efforts, you are dealing in a security. You are selling securities. In essence, if your investors are passive and you're active, you're doing all the work, it's a security. It doesn't matter whether it's an LLC, some kind of entity structure, a corporation, a general partnership, a profit-sharing agreement, joint venture, tenants in common. That's my favorite, the tenants in common arrangement. Like, well, there's 7 of us, and we'll just make everybody a direct owner of the property, and somehow now it's not a security because we're not selling interest in an LLC. It can be a handshake, it can be a high five. The structure itself does not matter. If you are taking money from passive investors, people are giving you money and the returns are generated by your efforts, you are dealing with a security. And when that happens, there's 3 things you've got to just immediately realize. And This is probably something you should maybe want to memorize. It's not that complicated, but at least that'll trigger your mind and say, okay, I got to talk to a lawyer. Number one, you need to register that security with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. You have to register that security with the SEC, or you need to find an exemption to the registration. Or, number three, it's illegal. It's that simple. You register the syndication or the security, you find an exemption, or it's illegal. Now, illegal, we talked a little bit about it earlier, it's not just being Bernie Madoff, right? So illegal offerings can be things like failing to provide all the proper disclosures, which we'll talk a little bit about in a little bit, or, for example, which we'll definitely talk about in a little bit, advertising on social media or some of these platforms when you're not supposed to. So even that would be considered an illegal offering. So again, I assume nobody wants to do an illegal offering, but it's not just Bernie Madoff stuff. And we never want to register the security itself either. Registration is basically going public, right? It's going to take you 18 months. It's going to cost you 6-7 figures. And if you're in contract to buy a building, how many of you have 18 months to wait for the SEC to approve your deal? It's just not realistic. So that's why everybody talks about an exemption to registration, which is where I live. That's my world. My world is trying to figure out what exemption can we find so that when you don't have to register the security, because if we don't register it, we've got to find an exemption. So that's what we talk about. And have you guys heard these, like the most common exemptions, like a 506B, 506C exemption? Anybody heard any of those? Okay. By the way, I should have asked this at the beginning. How many of you actually done a syndication? Can you raise your hand real quick before? Okay, awesome. How many of you not done a syndication but want to do one? Okay, cool. So 506B and 506E, if you're into syndication or you know anything about it, those two exemptions will come up, and they're part of this Reg D group of exemptions, and that's probably as technical as I want to get. But 506B and 506C are two of the most popular exemptions. In fact, about 95% of all syndicators use one of these two. And the reason they use them is two reasons. Number one, they're safe harbors. So if we hit all these bullet points that I'm going to show on the screen in a second, then we are assured of complying with the SEC. So we always want certainty. So we don't want to have to be arguing and guessing whether what we did was right. So having certainty is a big deal. And so we know that if we do these 4, 5, 6 things, we're good. The other really important thing is that it preempts state law. And preemption is just a fancy way of saying we don't have to worry about the states. Because if it didn't preempt state law, think about it. You guys are here are we technically in Boston? Or is that an insult? I don't know. Maybe. Who's here from Boston? All right. Oh, who thinks we're in Boston right now? All right, good. If you're in Boston and you have an investor in California and one in Texas and one in Maine or whatever, then you would have to actually go find a lawyer in every one of those states and hire that lawyer to make sure you're complying with California securities laws, Texas securities laws, and then not only pay them, but just make sure that you have to overcome all the landmines of all the different laws, which is a nightmare. It's expensive, it's time consuming, we don't want that. So the fact that these two preempt state law is what's made them super popular. There's some people call me and they throw out another random exemption. I'm like, yeah, that's great, except that covers you at the federal level, but now we got to go worry about the states, which is another thing. So what are the 506? I'll go this real quick because I don't want to spend too much time on this. I want to move on to the more juicy stuff. But here, I'm not even going to go through it. For 506B, 506C. 506B used to be the old rule. And like I said, you can raise an unlimited amount of money. You can take up to 35 non-accredited investors, which is a nice thing about 506B. Non-accredited are, anybody want to say, definition of an accredited investor, anybody want to shout it out? 2 million. Who said 2 million?
1 million. Not including your home.
There you go. $1 million, not including your personal residence, or $200,000 the last couple of years with a reasonable expectation of earning that this year. And if you're married, that goes up to $300,000. And you can blame California for adding the residential piece to that thing, because in California, back in the 2010s to 2010, everybody in California was an accredited investor because their home values were going up through the roof. So they added that to keep that. But that's one of the nice things about 506B. But not to go into each one, but basically the pivot or the reason.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second, because we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but maybe later. But can you talk about, because I know isn't there something changing with the accredited definition?
Yeah, there is something changing for the definition. Yeah, so let's talk about that real quick. So the SEC first came up with a proposed rule last year, and then not too long ago, it may have been at the end of last year, at the beginning, I forget when it was, they came out with basically final rules that they were going to be extending the definition of an accredited investor to include people who actually have a particular license, meaning there was a way for you to become accredited if you actually went and took an exam. And it's still a little bit murky because we know for sure that rule is going to pass. So if you have a Series 7, I think it is it a series? Do you know if I think it's a Series 7 license. Then you would be considered an accredited investor, which means if you're not accredited right now and you don't have the financial qualifications, you could, in theory, go study for that exam, take the exam and pass it, and now you become accredited, which kind of makes sense because it's like, well, the whole point is to make sure that you're somewhat sophisticated in what you're doing, and many will argue that the financial part doesn't really How many of you know people who are super, super rich that are like the most idiotic people in the world, right? And then there's other people who have no money or very little money that wouldn't be accredited, but they're super smart. So money's not necessarily the factor. So they are definitely expanding that. What they're also having some proposed rules on expanding it even further, where it may not just be a Series 7 financial license, but it might be some other type of licensing from another agency or educational thing, which is yet to be defined. And they've got a couple of different things that they're looking at and expanding. But for sure, probably at the end of this year or beginning of next year, you'll be able to become an accredited investor by having a Series 7 license. Then the question becomes, which I don't know if it's what that means, right? I mean, are your passive investors, going to go take an exam just so they can invest $50,000 or $100,000 in your deal? Who knows? But they are thinking about expanding it. So thanks for that. But the pivot point is really the advertising. So on 506B, the big limitation is you cannot advertise. So you cannot go on Facebook or LinkedIn or anybody on TikTok? All right, a couple people are there. Great. So you just can't go on social media. You can't go and put an ad in the newspaper. You can't do you certainly couldn't put together an event to go pitch your deal with a 506B. But when 506C came out, it kind of opened up the world and it actually allowed you to start advertising, which is why 506C was kind of cool. The main limitation with 506, which is the pivot point, is you cannot take any non-accredited investors. So those are the two things, advertising and accredited versus non-accredited. And so the questions you need to ask yourself off the bat is, number one, do you plan on advertising? If your answer is no, then 506B is probably your exemption. If your answer is yes, then you absolutely have to go 506C because that's the only one that allows you. And then the other question you can ask yourself is, do you plan on taking non-accredited? Because if you are, then you have to do 506B and you'd be prohibited. So that's kind of the main differentiations. But that's the reason that these are so popular, is because of the unlimited amount of money that you can raise, but more importantly, if you hit these bullet points, you are good to go. So anyway, so that's really number one, is just people in general not realizing that you are dealing with a security. And I see this a lot, actually, just parenthetically, in some of these forums, like Bigger Pockets. Anybody on Bigger Pockets? Like, Bigger Pockets is crazy. Like, people will be like, oh, look, I'm putting together some money because I'm going to go buy something, and then somebody's like, well, you should check with a securities lawyer, and they're like, why? Like, it's just so much of this going on, and people trying to get creative. So anyway, so that's the first thing. The next thing, what are we talking about? So the next thing is the social media advertising. So the second thing that every syndicator must know is, or should think about in order to avoid going to jail, is you can't, if you're relying on the 506B, you cannot use social media to advertise your deal. And this is a huge thing that's going on right now because for whatever reason it's going on. Like, I don't know if people just don't think that Facebook is advertising. They think, well, they're all my friends, and so, I'm not doing anything wrong. But social media platforms, I'm going to go with Facebook just because that's what I use. But when I say Facebook, just think any of the social platforms that you're on, whether you're on Instagram or LinkedIn or YouTube or Pinterest or Snapchat or TikTok. I'd like to see somebody pitch a deal on TikTok. So I think the reason that people think or don't think about social media, and actually let me just backtrack a bit. I always compartmentalize things. So I typically, when I think of things, when I write articles, a lot of times, if you've read my work, it'll always be like, the good, the bad, the ugly. Like, I just like to put things in compartment. It helps me, digest the material. And so when it comes to social media, what I end up thinking is to me, it's like there's a bucket or an area that you absolutely can do and you're fine on social media. There's another bucket which you absolutely cannot do in social media. And then there's that middle bucket, which is like a little bit of the gray area, which we're not quite sure. And the reason that this is frustrating for us is, just think about it. The last time things went south was back in 2008, right? This stuff did, I mean, it existed, but like nobody was on Facebook to the degree they are now. And so we don't really have any guidance from the SEC as what's really, really specifically applicable to social media. It all has to do with advertising in general. And so my belief is, at some point when things start to turn or go down, and whenever that is, whether it's next year or 10 years from now, whatever, it doesn't matter, that's when complaints will start, and that's when people will start looking into the social media issue. But let's talk about some of the things that you absolutely cannot do on social media. So we'll talk about what you can't do, we'll talk about what you can do, and then we'll talk about kind of the gray area. You obviously, I'm going to say obviously, but I still see it out there. Obviously, you cannot pitch your deal on social media. If you're only using 506B, if you're doing the 506C, you do whatever you want. But if you're doing 506B, which prohibits advertising, you cannot put your deal on the internet. And that's social media, and it includes your website, by the way. People forget that your website is public. It's blasted to the world. So having an executive summary or some reference to your deal on your website is a no-no, just like it's a no-no putting it on social media. I think that one's pretty easy to follow. What's tricky, though, is that just like the definition of a security is really broad, the definition of an offer, which is what we're worried about, the offer and sale of securities, the definition of an offer is super broad as well, according to the SEC. So it doesn't just cover direct pitches, but it also covers what's called conditioning the market. So when you condition the market, which means anything that you post that drums up interest about your deal, even though you don't specifically talk about your deal, that's going to be considered conditioning the market, and is going to be considered an offer and therefore a violation of the advertising rules. So my favorite, just to give you a couple of examples of what conditioning the market is, the easiest conditioning the market is when you talk a big game, even if you don't have an offer actually, about your prior returns. Like if you're on social media boasting that, hey, you should hire us because we provide 15% returns on your investments, give us a call and we'll show you how. You haven't talked about a specific deal, but clearly the reason you're saying that is to just garner interest and pump people up so they pick up the phone and call you. And by the way, the other thing I never really talked about is podcasting too. So all of this falls into social media, website, podcasting, what have you. It all comes in there. So that's one of the things, a good example. The other one I love is the due diligence videos, where people go and do due diligence on their properties, and inevitably they want to do a little video, and they just can't contain themselves, and they can't just talk about the due diligence. They have to add that it's an investment, and they're excited, and their investors are excited, and the investors are going to make a killing, and that crosses the line into conditioning the market. So I generally like to say, not in absolute terms, but if you have an existing offer out there, if you actually actively raising money for a deal, my recommendation would be to stay off of social media relating to real estate. I mean, post pictures about your kids and use social media in that way. But when it comes to the investments, just stay away from posting about the property, about real estate. Even if you try and get cute and just start putting out some articles about general stuff, you're just, I think, playing with fire, because conditioning the market is such a gray, what does that really mean, conditioning the market? And you don't want to be in a position where you're arguing with the regulators whether my intent to do something was one thing or another. Yeah.
Even after you close.
So let's talk. I'll get there in a second. The question is even after you close. So if you have an existing offer, stay away from social media, in my opinion. And if you don't have an offer, then you kind of get into the things where there's certain things you can absolutely post on social media, and I think that's when you take the opportunity to do these posts to actually legitimately gain traction and additional investors, which is ultimately what you're trying to do. And there's two things that we know for sure you can do on social media. Number one is you can always talk about factual information about you and your business. So you can always pump, you've got business, you've got a company to run, the SEC understands that, and so general marketing about your business and what you guys do, and maybe a link back to your website, as long as your website's clean, we can absolutely do that. The other thing that you can do is you can actually provide, which is the one I really highly encourage you guys to do, by the way, is provide valuable information, add value to the community, to the syndication community. So there's nothing wrong with putting out an article on why real estate is the greatest wealth creation vehicle in the world, or why Newton, Massachusetts is the greatest marketplace. I don't know if that's true or not, but if Newton, Massachusetts is the best place in the world to invest right now, and here's why, and these are the 5 reasons why. And then that can be what we call a lead magnet. You can get somebody's email in exchange for that report, and that's totally fine. I still want to caution you, and I think I've put it out a couple times, but I'm going to really start putting it out a lot, is if you're going to play that game, which is not really a game, but if you're going to put out content about your business and about you and value add and all that stuff that you should be doing, just be consistent. Just if you're going to do it once a week or once a month or whatever, just be consistent so that it's just all year round, this is kind of where you're at. What you don't want to do is post absolutely nothing all year round, and then lo and behold, a week before your offering, you see a huge spike in activity of all this great stuff, and then as soon as you close your offering, it goes back down to 0. Like, that's just not a good diagram. It's like a nice little bell curve, and you're just going to have a hard time arguing that this is just posted for factual information. It's going to be very clear that the intent was to drum up interest about your offering because of that bell curve. So if you're going to do that, just make sure you're consistent. And the fuzzy piece, which for me, and this is going to Dorina's question, which was, well, what about after you close? Can you make a post? You know, how many of you have seen those posts where people kind of, they brag? What about those types of posts? And my answer to that is it's definitely on the gray side. Well, let me tell you one that's not on the gray side, by the way. And this actually hit me about a month ago or 2 months ago. Not a lot of people. Some people, I don't know if you've ever done this, Matt, before, and I haven't. Some people will close on the property, but still have a little bit of money left to raise, and they continue to raise post-close because they're a little bit short, which is fine. So they close, and they got enough money for the down payment and the closing costs and all that stuff, but they still need another 50 grand or 100 grand just to finish it up, and that way they can get paid, all that stuff. So doing a post after you close the property, but then a week later you're still taking another 50 grand in because you're short, that's going to be clearly a violation of the advertising rule, because the minute you made that post, you're clearly advertising for that deal, and now you'd go out and raise some more money. So that's a clear violation. Where it gets fuzzy is like, well, what if you do that post, legitimately, you close the offering, you're raising no more money, and then you make that post. Remember, when you make that post, you're going to be potentially conditioning the market, not for the deal you just closed, but it's for the next potential deal down the road. That's the argument that the SEC would make, is well, that post is a conditioning the market for your next deal. So let me give you a couple of examples. And people forget, the reason I want to say this before I give my example, people forget that the syndication is not just for real estate investors, right? That's a really small piece of the market. People raise money all the time. Elon Musk raises money all the time for Tesla. There's startup companies that raise, Facebook had a couple of rounds. So people raise money all the time. If you're a startup company that has, started the company from scratch and now goes out to the marketplace because they need $1 million or $2 million to continue their startup, and they raise the money, they close it, and they all celebrate about the close, and they have no intention of raising any money ever again, then that post is clean, because they're not going to make another deal. Or if they do, they're going to make it 2 years from now, right? Contrast that with a real estate deal, or any other deal, but like a real estate deal where you close today and you've got another offering next week. In fact, you've already kind of started the other offer. You're already in contract for the next one, and so you close today, you do that, and lo and behold, next week you're like, hey, and by the way, we've got another deal coming in. You're probably going to fall somewhere in between, but those two extremes are where the further away you can get away your next deal from that post, I think the cleaner you'll be. The closer those two posts are together, I think is where you're going to have the trouble. So again, that's one of where I would put squarely in the bucket of it's a gray area. We just don't know.
Even if the post,
you're going to jail, Matt. Just face it. It's just it is what it is, and there's nothing I can do about it.
But if the post is not about here's the returns or any of that, it's just like, hey, we closed on 100 units in Worcester. Like, is that okay?
If you're going to look, one of the things I used to say, and I still stick by it, is if you're going to make posts, if you're going to ignore me and do the post, what I would do, and I'm not talking about Matt, I'm just like in general, because I'm on there hammering this point all day long. I would make sure that you make the post as in your mind you were buying the property by yourself. So, hey, I'm excited that maybe we have partners like Matt and I just closed this deal. We're super excited. Blah blah blah. As opposed to throwing in the investors, And certainly, some people literally will be like, oh, we're projecting 20% returns on this one. Like, that's clearly a violation, right? But again, to me, it's all sliding scale. So your example was on the safe side, which is we didn't bring up investors, we didn't bring up anything, we just brought about me and my partner, versus the other extreme, which is we brought up investors, and when people actually will throw in that we're anticipating X% returns, which is a clear, I think that one crosses the line.
Mauricio?
Yes, sir.
Question here.
Yeah.
What if it's in a Facebook group versus a normal post?
Unless you know every single person in that Facebook group and you have a relationship with them, then forget it. Or, I mean, not forget it, but that doesn't help you. Because, and I don't think I have time to talk, but I'll touch on it briefly. How much time do I have?
I should probably
50 or 60 minutes? What you mean?
all night.
Then I have a YouTube channel. I've got look, there, I'll pitch my YouTube channel. So on my YouTube channel, there's actually a great video that I did, which is how to establish a pre-existing substantive relationship with someone. How do you take somebody you just met somebody here, you've never met them in their life, you don't know them very well, what steps do you take them from today, where you barely know them, to having a substantive relationship so then you can absolutely offer them a future deal? And then the reason that comes up is because if you've got that Facebook group, you better make sure that everybody in that group, you have a pre-existing substantive relationship. So just YouTube my name, Mauricio Raoul, and that video will definitely pop up. So anyway, so that's number 2, and then we'll do one more since we're running out of time. And I've been hammering this one for a while, but the other big mistake people are making, and that you absolutely must know, is that you cannot pay people to raise money for you. You cannot pay people to raise money for you unless that person is a licensed broker-dealer, which I'm guessing, actually, anybody a broker-dealer in the room? Woo! You can pass out your business cards and you can get a lot of business. You cannot pay somebody unless you're transaction-based. And number 2, if you pay somebody transaction-based compensation, meaning it's somehow tied to the amount of money they raise, you are done. End of story. You are acting as a broker-dealer. That is the hallmark of a broker-dealer, okay? So examples, which I honestly still see today. Matt, if you give me if you can raise $1 million for you, I will give you 5% of the GP. If you raise $2 million for me, I'll give you 10% of the GP, and so on and so forth. Or really, it doesn't even have to be that extreme. It can literally be if you raise money for me, I will give you X% of the GP, or I will pay you X cash. You are done. The next thing you got to realize that even if you're not getting paid transaction-based compensation, that still doesn't mean that you're in the clear. Okay, you still cannot pay somebody compensation in exchange for raising money unless there's an exemption, some kind of an exemption, which is typically the issuer exemption, that is what everybody relies on. So when you're actually the company that is actually issuing or selling the security, doing the syndication, well, they're not raising money for somebody else, they're raising money for their own account, so that's fine. That's what the issue exemption is. And if it's a one-person show, it's generally accepted, that's fine. But everybody else, the GPs, the agents, all this stuff, they're not the issuer. So we've got to make sure that they are legitimate GPs in the deal, which means, number 1, they must be doing substantial work, and their primary role and responsibility must be something other than raising money. You have to be a legitimate co-GP, that you're not just raising the money, which is part of it, but you're doing the underwriting, you're doing the due diligence, you're doing the, talking to lawyers, doing all the things that you're doing as a syndicator. And then if you're a legitimate co-GP, you will most likely fall under the issuer exemption. But if you are not, if you're simply getting brought in as a GP to be the money raiser, you are violating that rule, and people are violating this rule day in and day out. And as I said before, everything's going great, so everybody's happy, and so none of this is really showing up, but when things start just turning, doesn't even have to go down, investors are going to get hurt, and that's what happens. That's the first thing they have. They pick up the phone, they'll call their regulator, and that's when they'll open up an audit, they'll call you, they'll ask for all your documents, and they'll ask for a list of your investors, and they'll call your investors, and trust me, when your investors have lost money, they're in no mood to help you out and tell things, whatever you want them to tell, even if it's true. So I know I'm running low on time, so what else do I have here? Oh, just if you want, I didn't bring any business cards, by the way, so if you want to get a hold of me, you can shoot me an email at social@premierlawgroup.com. That will actually give you that. I have a 5-part video series on the social media, how to raise money legally using social media. But if you send that email. I'll also, when the ebook is finally, delivered and designed or whatever, I'll send you a copy of the ebook, The 5 Things Every Syndicator Must Know to Stay Out of Jail.
Awesome.
There it is.